Well, today let's talk about what is perhaps the funkiest of Mopars ever produced, and that is the 1961 Imperial. Now, the 1961 Imperial was part of the third generation of Imperials that was introduced, or the so-called third wave, beginning in 1960 and lasting through 1963, before the Imperials would be redesigned for the 1964 model year. And this is really the last of Chrysler's chief stylist Virgil Exner's kind of run of Imperials, and they're certainly funky, to say the least. Now, before we get started on the actual car, let's talk a little bit about where Chrysler was in terms of its overall share position and success in the early 1960s. Well, many of you know, especially those who've been watching the channel, that Chrysler set the industry back on its heels when it introduced its forward-look cars for 1957. Those cars with the large fins and the thin roofs had beautiful styling, and they helped put Chrysler, in some cases, at the top of the sales charts. In fact, Chrysler's market share was almost 20% in 1957 when those cars came out, and that was really because of the styling success. However, by 1959, Chrysler sales had plummeted overall, and yes, there was a late 1950s recession, but their market share, which is not dependent upon the overall market itself, it's just dependent upon how the company performs relative to others, had plummeted from around 20% to just 11% in 1959. So their market share had been cut almost in half just in a few years. And why was this? Well, despite the fact that the 1957 Chrysler products were beautiful, their build quality was absolutely abysmal. They had everything from early rusting fenders because there were no wheelhouses in front of the wheels, to snapping torsion bars, to really just, let's say, a lot of teething problems associated with them. And as a consequence, their reputation caught up with them and the sales had plummeted precipitously. As a result, Chrysler decided to go in a new direction for 1960 and introduce a lot of new models in that particular model year. In particular, they revamped the underpinnings of their cars to be more rust-proof, and they spent about $350 million on re-engineering their vehicles and went to unitized construction. Chrysler introduced torsion bar front suspension in 1957 on those forward-look cars, but now it was torsion bar for suspension up front, leaf spring rear like it was before, but atop a unitized body for many of the Chrysler products. And the reason for this was that Chrysler was able to try to build these vehicles as the so-called quick, the strong, and the quiet, so that customers who were still driving those plagued 1957 vehicles thought that they were at least getting something that was more reliable and durable with the 1960 vehicles. Moreover, Chrysler kind of revamped its dealer network during this time frame. There was a long time pair-up between Plymouth and Dodge in terms of the overall franchises, but Chrysler was trying to separate them, similar to how General Motors had separated the dealers of each of its makes. And Plymouth dealers were able to survive on their own with the volume. And of course, for 1960, they would also get the Valiant to sell, not the Plymouth Valiant, but the Valiant by Plymouth. And Dodge would separate from the Plymouth dealers by getting a low-priced car of their own, the Dart, which was, let's just say, an interesting-looking vehicle of its own.
Now, the Dart, at least for the 1960 and 61 model years, was a low-priced full-size vehicle, but for 1961, Dodge dealers would also get the beautiful-looking variant of the Valiant, the Dodge Lancer, and I will just leave it at that. But now back to the 1961 Imperial, now that you understand the context in which it was introduced. Now let's take a look at this crazy, funky 1961 Imperial convertible. And it's funky, but I have to say that I love this car and this overall design. The 61 is the most, let's say, funky of the 61, 2, and 3. By 1963, Elwood Engel was already starting to impart his influence on Chrysler styling, having arrived in 1962. And he toned down the car, relatively speaking. It was also toned down a bit for 1962. 61 has the big fins out back, and that's one of the identifying marks of the 61s. Now up front, you have a full new face for Imperial for 61, and that's really marked by these 4 quad headlamps, let's say, that are freestanding pods, and they're residing in this cove in the fender. Talk about a complex fender form and shape. Imagine what it would take to form that piece of metal overall, and imagine the clay sculptors just scalloping out the clay around the grill and behind those pod-like headlamps. I don't know how you clean back there, by the way. You must have some sort of a special brush to make sure that you get all the dirt and grime that would reside back there. But clearly this particular copy is a clean copy. Now, I love the front with the very linear grille, and then you have almost like these eyebrows over top of those pod headlamps with the turn signals, and then that piece of stainless that runs from the kind of, well, we'll call it not quite the middle of the hood, but inboard section of the hood, wraps around the fender, and then kind of has this diving line on the side of the car. And notice it's not just a piece of bright work on the side, but it's accentuating a surface on the car. Underneath it, you notice that there is a little radius that forms, and notice the highlight that that's causing underneath the piece of bright work trim. I also love the asymmetrical nature of the grille with that eagle on the driver's side that is encompassed in this red kind of rectangle-like box thing. It's pretty sweet. For 1962, the grille would be completely different. For whatever reason, Imperial would go to the split grille theme, but for 61, they had this long, beautiful linear grille with that eagle on the left-hand side, another identifying mark of 61 Imperials. Now, as we rotate the frame a little bit more, I have to say that it's pretty evident from this photo that there's some interesting manufacturing things going on here. Notice how small that area is to access the engine bay and how big the top of the fender is, and it wraps around the front of the hood. This is a so-called trapped hood design where you have to control it dimensionally on 3 sides, the left, center, and right of the hood. But an interesting manufacturing piece here is that I suspect that stainless piece that wraps around from the front of the car to the side is actually disguising the fact that the fender starts below that particular piece of bright work. And then this, I'll call it the part of the hood that wraps over top of the fender, is a separate piece of metal. So it's actually disguising that there are 2 pieces of metal here, and kind of clever and ingenious. Very similar to what this car would have on the quarter panels with the piece of bright work atop the fins that disguises the fact that that fin is actually 2 pieces at the top. There's the piece that's on the outer edge of the car and the piece that's on the inner edge, because you otherwise couldn't form sheet metal this way. So designers and engineers were working together hand in hand when it came to this 61 Imperial. And I can only imagine the headaches that the engineers went through trying to get those freestanding pods to not jiggle over bumps. The structure to hold those up is just immensely, let's say, robust. Now, as we rotate along to the side of the car, notice how immense this Imperial is. It rode atop a 129-inch wheelbase. This car is about 227 inches in overall length, so for the time, it was a bit of a monster. It certainly wasn't the longest Chrysler product that was ever made. That honor would be bestowed upon the 1973 Imperial, which would be about 235 inches in overall length. But that car had bigger bumpers and bumper guards. This is just all style. Now, notice how beautifully that top of the fender, which is a very flat, let's say, surface, just transitions into the smooth shoulder on the door, and then that shoulder on the door as it goes rearward starts to become the fin, and the fin just organically rises out of the leading edge of that quarter panel. It's a fantastic looking design. The only thing to me that's a little interesting is the rear overhang, as is typical for this era, is extremely large. And the dash to axle up front is also not all that great. There's a fair amount of front overhang in an era where oftentimes the designers were really trying to push the windshield back and the front axle forward. So a little bit typical, I call it atypical proportions. This car actually looks like it needs a bit more wheelbase, if anything, than less. But the body side here is otherwise relatively simple, although you do have this beautiful surface that is formed coming from in front of the front wheel, just underneath that bright work, and it tapers gently as it goes rearward and then just kind of blends in on the quarter panel. I love the way that the stylists executed that. Now, as we rotate to the rear three-quarter view, we see more expensive elements of this particular design. Now, as I mentioned, there's clearly that piece of bright work atop the quarter panel that is disguising the fact that there's two pieces of metal there. And there's a lot of metal finishing on this car, because notice underneath the tail lamp that it's just a smooth, unbroken surface from the quarter panel around to the deck lid area. I suspect that is metal finished in a separate piece of metal, because there's no way that you could make, obviously, a piece of sheet metal that forms the quarter and then it wraps around to form, let's call it, the area surrounding the deck lid. There must be a parting line underneath some metal finishing there. But a clever way to disguise all these different pieces of metal and make the car look very custom. It doesn't look like it has a series of body panels. It looks like it's basically one big body panel, aside from the fact that the car has two doors. But look at how there's no parting line around the quarter as it transitions into that deck lid area. Of course, the deck lid itself needs a parting line, but the car otherwise just looks very custom because of this beautiful blend of manufacturing capability combined with design, combined with some very expensive metal finishing on this car. I have to say, I also love these tail lamps and the kind of rocket exhaust and freestanding pods. Notice the freestanding nature that was employed in the headlamps is, again, exemplified here in the tail lamps, although in a different design and a different style. I love the nacelle as well around the tail lamp, and how the tail lamp itself, the red portion, looks like it's just kind of floating there. What a fantastic look. Of course, in this car, you have the so-called flight sweep deck lid. I think that's what Chrysler called it during this time frame. Some people called it the toilet bowl for the Imperial, but that's not a great name for it. And you have this beautiful integration of the bumper inset into the body, and the body trimmed in bright work around where that break between the body and the bumper exists. Notice as well the quality of the sheet metal here and the reflections on the side. These are big body panels, and stamping them would often incite ripples in the sheet metal. But Chrysler engineers were really trying to improve the quality perception, and the reflections on this car look absolutely perfect. I can tell you, if you look at my 1972 Imperial, you see these little ripples in the sheet metal because the quarters are so large that it was just hard to form them perfectly. And unfortunately, Chrysler didn't take much time, I guess, in the early 70s to really work on that. But here in 1960, they certainly did, and the beauty shows. Now, as we rotate to the interior, one of the things I love about these Imperials is not only is the exterior funky, but the interior is almost even more funky. I mean, look at this Squircle-style steering wheel with the two-spoke horn pad there. I guess I shouldn't call it a horn pad. There's a horn ring on this, but the kind of two-spoke wheel that fades into a vanishing point there in the center. Man, that is so cool. You have these pods flanking the speedometer and full gauges. On the leftmost pod, look at where the turn signal indicator is there at the top of the pod. Pretty awesome. And then the push-button torque flight selector is included in that pod. On the right pod, unfortunately, this car has been bastardized. That would be the HVAC controls. And this one has aftermarket AC added, and I think that's what those round knobs are. The Imperial didn't have those round knobs from stock. But otherwise, this interior is definitely stock. And imagine just sitting behind the wheel in this car and piloting it down the road. What a special feeling. And here's a little zoomed in picture of the instrument cluster so you can see it better. Again, those torque flight transmission push buttons, that beautiful two-spoke wheel. Again, I can't really think of another car that has a steering wheel that kind of tapers in towards this vanishing point almost, or a horizon point in the middle of the steering wheel. It's just so cool. Of course, it is kind of inset for safety. They were starting to think about safety. There's no collapsible steering column in this car. But there are padded portions of the dash. You see the lower portion in particular of the passenger area is very well padded as a crash pad. So automakers and designers were starting to think increasingly of safety, although all of the various safety provisions were not yet apparent in vehicles. And before we rotate to the underhood area, here's one more picture of the passenger compartment. These are certainly full-size convertibles, and the back seat's a little bit tight, but at the same time, if you're looking for a convertible with quite a bit of space, it's hard to beat one of these Imperials overall, and I think you'll agree the interior is as funky as it is beautiful. Now, under hood in these 61 Imperials is Chrysler's wedge engine, a 413 cubic inch V8 that made 350 horsepower. Interestingly, it was still 413 cubic inches in 1962 and 1963, but the horsepower went down to 340. Not quite sure why. Maybe Chrysler decided to relax a little bit after Lincoln went to a two-barrel carburetor in 1960, and that really dropped the horsepower on the 430 cubic inch V8s during the late 50s and early 1960s, when Robert McNamara just felt that four-barrel carburetors on a car like a Lincoln were just excessive. And so you got huge 430 cubic inch V8s with two-barrel carburetors, as an example, in the 1960 and early 1960s Lincolns. But regardless, here, a very durable, reliable engine. This 413 would power this Imperial. That was obviously a big and heavy car. It would go 0 to 60 in about 9 seconds. So, it doesn't sound fast for this time frame, but to hustle this amount of car in that amount of time, to 60 miles an hour, it's actually a pretty impressive feat. And that's with bias ply tires and things that didn't have great traction. So with radial tires, you probably even get a little bit better traction and better times. And I must point out on the underbody here, I mentioned that Chryslers in general went to unibody for 1960, but the Imperials would not go to unibody until the 1967 model year. So take a look at the frame construction here. This is a massive frame that, because it's a convertible, they also have the cross bracing. This is one of the reasons why these cars were banned from demolition derbies, because they were so sturdy, so rugged. Everybody, if you had a demolition derby, wanted an Imperial because they were just so well built in terms of the, I should say, well, I don't know about well built, I guess. They had better quality during this time frame than other times for Chrysler, but they certainly had rugged construction. Maybe I'll put it that way. So you got a pretty sweet car overall. What do you think of this 1961 Imperial? Is it the craziest, funkiest car you think from the 1960s? Put a comment in the comment section. If it's not, let me know what you think is. Thanks again for watching.